I never thought I'd be back in the thick of it, not after everything I'd seen, not after the military years, not after I bought my piece of quiet land in Simmons Valley, population maybe 200 on a weekend. I'd buried enough ghosts on foreign soil to last 10 lifetimes. All I wanted was to raise chickens, fix my old truck, and leave the world to rot without me, but the world, it turns out, doesn't like to be ignored. Especially not when it needs a man like me. The first warning came as a letter. No stamp. Just folded neatly, and wedged into my gate's latch with a thin piece of rusted wire. On plain paper, in an aggressively casual font, it read, "Welcome to Simmons Valley Estates. As a homeowner, you are expected to comply with the covenant. Non-compliance will result in corrective action." There was no signature. No HOA logo. Just that phrase. Corrective action. I read it 3 times, then burned it in the fire barrel behind the barn. I knew there wasn't an actual HOA in Simmons Valley. I'd done my research before buying this land. 10 acres of scrub pine and rocky soil that I carved into something livable with my own hands. No covenants. No board. No monthly meetings about flower beds. But someone wanted me to believe otherwise. A few days later, they started testing my perimeter. It started subtle. A broken branch near the north tree line. Boot prints in the silt near the dry creek bed. Once, I found a cigarette, but still warm on the flat rock I used as a marker post. No one around here smoked menthols. I knew the signs. These weren't drifters. This was recon. They parked a vehicle somewhere out of line of sight, came in through the woods, stayed low. Someone who knew how to move without being seen. I activated the thermal cams I kept buried in pelican cases. Set tripwires. Not to harm, just to warn. Then, on a night when the moon was barely a thumbnail in the sky, I caught them. 2 men in black. Civilian gear, but with movement so tight, so fluid, it took me half a second to clock it. Military. They moved up the gravel drive in silence, one covering the other as they neared the side barn. The way they pivoted, back to back, hands low, it was second nature. This wasn't a prank. I sat in the dark of my kitchen, watching the live feed from the outdoor IR cams. Their heat signatures glowed red on the screen. I recognized that posture. That kind of silence. They weren't trying to break in. They were taking pictures. Mapping the property. The next morning, I found another letter. Violation. Unauthorized fencing style. Violation. Unsanctioned livestock. Violation. Improper concealment of utility box. It ended with a fine total. $2 for 100. They'd attached a grainy black and white photo of my barn from a high angle, which meant they had a drone. The more I dug, the more twisted it became. The so-called HOA had no name on file. No tax status. No filing with the county. But they had rules, pages of them. Some mimicking real HOA documents I'd seen back in city cases. I asked around at the feed store. Most of the locals rolled their eyes. "Yeah, we get those letters too." One man muttered. "They ain't real. But folks pay anyway. Otherwise things go bad." I asked him what bad meant. He just looked down and said, "My dog went missing. My mailbox got blown up. No one saw anything." That's when I started hunting names. I traced a P.O. box used in one of the letters to a company called Circle One Holdings. It sounded like a title firm or a property management group, but it wasn't listed anywhere normal. No website, no licensing. Just a registration in a neighboring state under a long-dead shell company. I reached out to a few old friends. Quietly, one of them, a guy named LaRue who owed me a favor from a mission in Helmand, gave me a short reply. "Circle One isn't real. It's a net. Don't step in it," which of course meant I had to step in it. I began treating my property like a forward operating base. Set counter surveillance. Installed decoys. Rotated sensor positions. The game was no longer about hiding. It was about letting them think they were seeing what they wanted. When what they saw was what I wanted them to see. I turned my land into a trap. That's when Jake McBride showed up. It was like seeing a ghost. He rolled in on a matte black motorcycle, boots dusty, eyes hidden behind aviators. I hadn't seen Jake since Kandahar. Last I'd heard, he was working private security for some federal contractors overseas. He parked at the end of my drive, like he didn't want to be too close to the house. "I came to talk," he said, taking off the glasses. His voice hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had. I didn't invite him in. We stood near the truck, sun baking the gravel beneath our boots. "They say you've been stirring things up," Jake said, "making a lot of noise. Just minding my own land," I said. He nodded real slow. "Some folks don't want you minding it too much." There it was. The thread dressed as a courtesy. "Who sent you, Jake?" He hesitated. Then, "You remember Reyes?" I did. He'd been one of us. Tech guy. Good with systems. Disappeared after his second deployment. "Reyes runs ops for Circle One now," Jake said. "And he says this ain't about you. Not yet. But if you keep pushing." I stared at him. "You think I scare easy?" Jake didn't smile. "I think you don't know how big this gets." Then he left. I watched his taillight disappear into the dust. That night, I found a new camera buried near the fence line. The casing was military grade, and I knew, for certain now, that this wasn't a local HOA dispute. This was something else, something bigger, something that knew how I moved, how I thought, and exactly how far I was willing to go. But what they didn't know, what they always forget, is that I don't fight fair. Not anymore. I didn't sleep the night after Jake's visit. Instead, I sat in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee. The bitter taste of comfort. Outside, the wind moaned around the eaves of the house. Sometimes it's not the physical threats that wear you down, it's the waiting. The knowledge that people are watching you, moving in shadows, deciding how far they can push before you'll break. I kept remembering Jake's face. How he couldn't quite look me in the eye. We'd shared a bunker once, 20 hours under mortar fire in Kandahar. He'd pulled me out of rubble. And now, he was the face of the people trying to break me. That betrayal ran deeper than anything else. I spent the following days digging into Circle One. I set up an entire table in my living room with laptops, printed documents, maps with pushpins marking sightings of drones and strange vehicles. Every connection I found made me feel sicker. Circle One wasn't just private contractors. They were ex-military. PsyOps specialists. Counterintelligence people who disappeared from official rosters years ago. I found online chatter suggesting they tested community compliance models in rural areas in several states. They'd use fake HOA notices, bogus fines, intimidation tactics, all designed to study how average Americans would react under sustained psychological pressure. It wasn't just me they were after. They were refining a blueprint. I couldn't believe how deep it went. One file I hacked from a hidden drive listed subject profiles for Simmons Valley. I read the summaries with growing rage. Subject: Am Vaughn. Female. Widow. Age 72. High vulnerability due to social isolation and financial stress. Recommend low-level intimidation to ensure compliance. Subject: R. Henderson. Male. Veteran. Age 68. Possible agitator. Monitor closely for anti-government rhetoric. Consider controlled stress events. Subject: D. Callahan. Male. Veteran. Age 44. High threat potential. Special operations background. Monitor extensively. Potential escalation required. I wanted to punch through the drywall. These were my neighbors. People who waved at me from porches. People who'd brought me casseroles when I first moved in. Now they were classified like enemy combatants. Meanwhile, the intimidation ramped up. One night, someone cut my power. I woke in darkness, the house too silent. I grabbed a flashlight, crept room to room. Outside, I found a man standing near the barn, aiming a thermal camera at my windows. I flicked on my tactical spotlight, blinding him. He stumbled backward and took off running. The next morning, my mailbox was ripped out of the ground and thrown through my truck windshield. I called the sheriff's department. Deputy arrived, shaking his head. Chief, whoever's doing this is organized. They leave no fingerprints. No tire tracks we can trace. I stared at the shattered glass on my truck seat. I know who it is. But they're hiding behind federal secrecy. The deputy sighed. This is bigger than us, isn't it? Yeah, I said. A lot bigger. Then came the drones. At first, they hovered high, distant hums I could barely hear. But then, they dropped lower, buzzing over my house at treetop level, cameras tilted toward my doors, and windows. I shot one down with my rifle. It crashed into the field. Smoking. I hauled it into my garage, broke it apart. Inside, I found a SIM card. I plugged it into my laptop, and found hundreds of gigabytes of video, of me walking my property, working in the barn, talking to neighbors. They even recorded my conversations with David on the porch. I felt like I'd been stripped naked. I stared at my own face frozen on the screen, mouth half open mid-sentence. That was the worst moment. Not the physical threats. Not even the property damage. It was realizing they'd stolen my privacy. My life. I decided then that I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd take the fight to them. So I flipped my property into a labyrinth of traps and decoys. I moved cameras every night. Set up fake power lines to confuse thermal imaging. Built false walls inside the barn to conceal my real surveillance hub. And I started feeding Circle 1 disinformation. But Circle 1 was also relentless. One afternoon, I went to check on Mrs. Vaughn. I found her sitting on her porch, hand shaking around a mug of tea. They told me if I don't pay the fine, I'll lose my house, she whispered. That they'll take it under Homeland Security rules. I knelt beside her. Listen to me. There's no real HOA. Those fines are lies. They can't take your house. She looked into my eyes. But they have badges. They said I was on a list. I felt fury boil in my chest. They're bluffing. They're criminals pretending to be the government. But I saw the fear in her eyes. That's what Circle 1 wanted most. To make ordinary people feel they had nowhere to turn. Meanwhile, Jake kept circling me. He showed up again late one night, standing on the dirt road near my mailbox. Callahan, he called softly. We need to talk. I kept my distance. Nothing left to say, Jake. You're putting a target on yourself, he said. Karen's not the top of the food chain. If you keep poking, they'll crush you. I'm not afraid. He laughed sadly. I know. That's what scares them. We stared at each other for a long moment. The night was silent around us except for the rustling of dry grass. Then Jake lowered his voice. You don't understand how far this goes. They're watching every town like this. Testing who resists, who submits. It's a playbook. Then burn it. I growled. Jake shook his head. It's not that simple. He turned to leave but paused. For what it's worth. I'm sorry. And then he was gone, swallowed into the dark. I stood there under the stars, the wind cold against my face, remembering all the times Jake and I had saved each other's lives. I went back inside and spent the rest of the night cataloging data. Because Jake was right about one thing. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's. As winter turned Simmons Valley into a brittle, frozen place. The fight kept creeping closer to my doorstep. My neighbors were unraveling. I saw it in their eyes when I passed them at the gas station or the post office. People who used to smile and chat about the weather would look away, mumbling excuses. I knew that look. I'd seen it in war zones where entire villages fell silent because someone had whispered that a bomb might be planted under the road. Fear was a contagion. One evening, I went to check on Mr. Henderson, the retired Navy chief who lived alone at the far end of the road. He opened the door just a crack, chain still in place. Chief, I said quietly. It's me, Callahan. He didn't undo the chain. They were here last night, he whispered. Said they'd fine me for non-compliant roof shingles. I told them to go to hell. This morning my truck tires were slashed. Did you see who did it? They wore uniforms, Henderson said. Looked official. Badges. Radios. But no names. I clenched my fists. I'm going to stop them. Henderson's eyes watered. You can't stop ghosts, son. He shut the door. Driving home at night, snow swirling around my headlights, I realized this was no longer about me. Circle 1 was waging war on the entire valley. 2 days later, I found tire tracks winding up my back pasture. I followed them to a spot where the snow was churned up, footprints scattered everywhere. There, half buried under pine needles, was a box. Military issue. Olive green. I pried it open and found a small drone. This one was advanced. Thermal imaging, directional microphones, high-resolution optics. A sticky note was taped to the casing. We see you, Callahan. I crushed the note in my hand, heart pounding. That night, I set up my own drone, flying it in tight circles around my property. I scanned for heat signatures. At 2:43 a.m., I caught 3 men moving in single file through the trees. I tracked them until they vanished into the dark. But at least I had proof. I started compiling all the footage into a master folder labeled Circle 1, Domestic Ops. Meanwhile, David tried to keep life normal. He'd bring me coffee in the mornings. He'd talk about recipes, movies, music. But his eyes always flicked to the windows, scanning the woods. One night, he said quietly, "Do you ever wish you'd never bought this place?" I shook my head. "No. This is my home. And I'll die before I let them steal it." David stared at me for a long time. "I believe you." But his voice trembled when he said it. The next escalation came on a Sunday. I'd driven into town for supplies. When I returned, I saw a motorcycle parked near my front gate, black, chrome accents, and sitting on it, arms crossed, was Jake. He nodded as I stepped out of my truck. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm not." Jake sighed. "Karen's just a piece of this. She's a handler. The real people running Circle 1, they're not going to stop." "Good," I said. "Neither am I." He kicked at the gravel. "You remember Helmand Province? The guys who thought they could push locals around until the locals pushed back?" I said nothing. Jake looked up, eyes pained. "This is going to end the same way. People are going to get hurt." I stepped closer. "Why are you still involved?" Jake's shoulders slumped. "Because if I'm in it, maybe I can protect you. From the inside." I stared at him, searching for the man I used to know. Jake dropped his voice. "Reyes is out of control. He thinks you're a threat that needs neutralizing. I am a threat," I snapped. "To people like him." Jake swallowed hard. "I'm trying to keep this from turning bloody." I lowered my voice. "Then give me Reyes." Jake hesitated. Then he shook his head. "I can't." He started his bike. Before he rode away, he shouted over the engine, "Watch your 6, Callahan." He vanished in a swirl of exhaust and gravel. I stood there, breath misting in the cold, rage boiling in my chest, because I knew Jake was right about one thing. This would turn bloody if it kept going. Meanwhile, Circle 1 was tightening its grip. One night, I came home to find my front door standing open. I stepped inside, Glock raised, heart hammering. Every single photograph I owned was gone from the walls. I in their place. Taped to the drywall were black and white prints of me, sleeping, walking to my truck, talking to David on the porch. Each photo was labeled with timestamps and GPS coordinates. I in thick black marker. Someone had written across the photos, "We own you." I spent the entire night tearing my house apart, searching for bugs. I found 2 tiny transmitters hidden inside electrical outlets. I smashed them both. Afterward, I sat on my couch, shaking, adrenaline roaring through my veins. David found me there at dawn. He knelt in front of me, eyes red. "Callahan, they're trying to break you. They're failing," I whispered. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. I kept seeing those photos in my dreams. I kept hearing Jake's voice. "They're not going to stop." But the worst was what they were doing to the neighbors. Mrs. Vaughn stopped me in the road one afternoon. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "They told me I'd lose my social security," she sobbed. "They said I was on a terrorist watch list." I felt like my ribs were splitting apart. "Mrs. Vaughn, you listen to me," I said. "None of that is true. You are not a terrorist. You are my neighbor." She sobbed harder. "I just want them to leave me alone." I gripped her shoulders. "They will. I promise you. They will." But in my chest, I wondered if I could keep that promise, because Circle 1 was pressing us all closer to the edge. And I knew the time was coming when someone would snap. I knew the time was coming when I might snap. And I wasn't sure who I'd be when that happened. A few days after the photos appeared on my walls, things finally turned physical. It was just after midnight. I was running another perimeter check when I heard the crunch of gravel down near my workshop. I crept forward in the darkness, Glock steady in my hand, senses dialed up so high I could hear my own blood in my ears. A figure loomed near the barn door, fiddling with the padlock. I slipped closer, silent as a shadow, until I could see his silhouette in the moonlight, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black hoodie. "Drop it," I growled. The man spun toward me, one hand flashing to his waistband. I fired. Not at him, but at the ground by his feet. Dirt exploded upward. He yelped and bolted into the darkness. I chased him 50 yards before losing him among the trees. When I returned to the barn door, my hands were shaking. He'd left a crowbar behind. Taped to its handle was a note. "Next time, we don't run." That night, I sat on my porch until dawn, shotgun across my knees. David came outside around 6. Hair rumpled from sleep. He glanced at the weapon in my lap, then sat beside me. "Are you okay?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Finally, I said, "They're pushing me. They want me to make a mistake so they can justify coming in guns blazing." David laid his head on my shoulder. "Then don't give them that excuse." I stared out at the pale sky. "No, but I'm not standing down either." A few days later, the intimidation turned uglier. I found a dead rabbit nailed to my fence post. Its throat slit. Blood dried into rust-colored streaks across the wood. Pinned beneath its paws was a piece of paper. "Move, or your next." I buried the rabbit and burned the note. Then I drove into town and bought more cameras, more motion sensors, and a fresh batch of thermal drones. It felt like prepping for another war zone. But this time, the battlefield was my backyard. Meanwhile, Circle 1 psychological warfare spread deeper into the neighborhood. Neighbors started calling me at all hours. One night, Mr. Finley phoned in a panic. "They're sending men in SUVs, Callahan. Dark windows. Parking outside my house. Just sitting there." "Did you get plates?" I asked. "They're all government plates," he whispered. "But no agency name. Just numbers." "Stay calm," I said. "Keep your lights on. Keep a camera rolling. Call me if they step out of the car. They said they'd foreclose on me if I talk to you again." I swallowed the rage burning in my chest. "Then talk to me anyway." He hung up without saying goodbye. 2 nights later, I got a message on my laptop. An encrypted window popped up out of nowhere. We're not done, Callahan. You can't protect them all. I smashed my fist against the table, sending coffee flying. David rushed into the room. Callahan! What is it? I pointed at the screen. He read the message, then turned to me with tears in his eyes. Why you? Why us? Because we're not supposed to question them. I said. Because people like Karen think they own this country. The next day, Jake showed up again. He parked his bike halfway up my drive and sat there with the engine idling. I approached cautiously, weapon holstered but hand resting on the grip. Jake cut the engine and pulled off his helmet. His eyes looked hollow. Callahan. Reyes has greenlit direct action. I stared at him. Meaning what? Meaning, if you don't back down, they'll make it look like you attacked them first. And they'll be cleared to use lethal force. My jaw clenched. Tell Reyes to come say it to my face. Jake lowered his voice. I've been trying to protect you. But I can't keep this up. They're watching me now too. You're either with them or with me, Jake. I said. Pick a side. Jake's gaze fell. It's not that simple. It's always that simple. I snapped. You stand with the people who stand for freedom. Or you stand with the tyrants. Jake swallowed hard. I'm sorry. He started his bike and roared away, leaving me alone in a swirl of dust. That evening, I gathered my files and drove into town. I slipped into the back room of the diner where Paul, my old deputy buddy, sat nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as I sat down. Jesus, Callahan, you look like you've been through hell. I have. I spread photos across the table. Drone footage. Screenshots from hacked servers. Photos of the men sneaking around my property. Paul's jaw tightened as he flipped through the evidence. They're really running black ops in our own backyard. He muttered. I nodded. And if we don't stop them, they'll keep rolling this program out nationwide. Paul scrubbed his face with his hands. I'm in. Whatever you need. I took a deep breath. I need the feds involved. Legitimate ones. We have to shine daylight on Circle 1. Paul nodded grimly. Consider it done. When I got home, I found David sitting on the porch steps. He looked up as I approached. I can't live like this forever, Callahan, he said quietly, looking over my shoulder, wondering who's watching us. I know, I said. Neither can I. But you won't stop. No, I admitted. Because if I stop, they win. David swallowed. His voice broke. I just want our life back. I knelt in front of him, gripping his hands. So do I. And that's why I'm fighting. He blinked back tears. Promise me one thing. What's that? Promise me you'll come back alive. I squeezed his fingers. I'll try. But you know I can't promise that. He let out a shaky laugh. Yeah, I know. I pulled him into a hug, feeling his heart beating hard against mine. Because the truth was, as much as I wanted to keep him safe, I wasn't sure if any of us would make it through what was coming. Circle 1 was closing in, and the only way out was through. They dropped me on the highway like a package nobody wanted. By the time I climbed into my truck, dawn was bleeding across the sky in streaks of pink and gold. I drove home with the sun rising behind me, the wheel vibrating under my hands. My land looked the same as it always had, frost cresting the fields, birds drifting overhead. But nothing was the same. I parked beside the barn and just sat there for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled. Then I got out, went inside, and started writing. I wrote for hours. Everything I'd learned. Everything I'd seen. Every name I knew. I built a file that would crack open Circle 1 like a hammer shattering glass. When I finished, I encrypted it and sent it to 6 people, Nelson at the bureau, LaRue, and 4 journalists I trusted. Then I drafted another letter, this one for my neighbors. I told them the truth, that there was no HOA. That we'd all been targeted. That Karen and her people had used fear like a crowbar to pry open our lives. That bikers and drones and fake fines were tools of a bigger machine. They tried to isolate us. I wrote. But we're stronger together. Don't pay another dime. Don't open your door to strangers who flash badges without names. And if they come for you, call me. I printed 50 copies and hand-delivered them door to door, slipping them under doormats, tucking them into screen doors. I drove past Mrs. Vaughn's place and saw her peeking through her curtains. When our eyes met, she opened the door and whispered, Is it safe now? I told her. Not completely. But we're not alone anymore. Within days, my mailbox overflowed. Handwritten notes. Emails. Voicemails from neighbors who'd stayed silent for months. They threatened my wife. They put cameras in my trees. I've been paying for 5 years. I thought I was the only one. I organized a meeting at the community hall. The first night, only 10 people showed up. They were nervous, glancing around like we were about to get raided. I stood in front of them and laid it all out. How Circle 1 operated. How Karen had orchestrated it. How federal agencies were using neighborhood disputes as camouflage for something darker. An old man in a flannel shirt stood up. His voice trembled. They told me I'd go to jail if I didn't pay. My wife's been crying herself to sleep. I said. You're not going anywhere. We'll fight it together. By the second meeting, 30 people showed up. By the third, the hall was packed. Neighbors who'd barely spoken in years now stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, eyes burning with anger. One woman held up a stack of papers. They said my son was a domestic threat. He's 12. His crime was riding his bike past the wrong fence. The room erupted in outrage. Kyle, the Marine vet, stood up and said, We've been living under occupation. That's what this is. It's domestic counterinsurgency. And I'm sick of it. People cheered. I watched it happen and felt something unfurl in my chest. For months, they tried to isolate me, to make me doubt what I saw. Now the entire neighborhood stood with me. A few days later, news trucks rolled in. The first local channel reported, Veteran exposes covert HOA surveillance ring in Simmons Valley. Then the national networks picked it up. Federal program Circle 1 linked to illegal surveillance in small towns. By the end of the week, senators were screaming on the Sunday shows about civil liberties, secret programs, and corruption. The Department of Justice announced an investigation. Karen Whitaker was arrested at her townhouse in the next county. Footage showed her being let out in cuffs, hair askew, lips pressed into a thin, angry line. I watched the broadcast in silence. David sat beside me, fingers laced with mine. It's over. I shook my head. No. It's only begun. Because the investigation unearthed something even bigger. Documents revealed Circle 1 wasn't unique to Simmons Valley. They tried similar operations in 15 other regions. Sometimes they'd run through fake HOAs. Other times, they'd infiltrated church groups, local business associations, even online parenting forums. They built databases of who questioned authority, who had weapons training, who posted anti-government comments online. They called it behavioral compliance. I called it a domestic enemy. I started getting calls from people all over the country. Chief Callahan? I think my HOA is fake too. They're fighting me for my curtains. Can they do that? They threatened to report me as unstable. What should I do? My days became a blur of phone calls, emails, Zoom interviews. Meanwhile, life in Simmons Valley was transforming. One Saturday morning, we tore down the fake Simmons Valley Estates sign Karen's crew had planted by the highway. It crashed into the dirt, splintering under a sledgehammer Kyle swung with relish. Neighbors cheered. Mrs. Vaughn wiped tears off her face and said, "It feels like we're taking back our home." We started rebuilding. We organized real neighborhood meetings, transparent, democratic. People volunteered for community watch groups. They planted flowers in yards left barren for months. Kids rode their bikes again. People waved from porches. But scars lingered. One neighbor sold his house and left town, unable to face the memories of threats and midnight surveillance. Another woman still kept her blinds shut tight, afraid Karen's people might come back. I visited her one afternoon, sat on her porch and told her, "You don't have to hide anymore. We're not going to let them win." She nodded but didn't open the door, and I understood. Some wounds don't heal quick. Meanwhile, the fallout spread nationwide. A congressional hearing dragged Circle 1 into the spotlight. I was called to testify. I stood in a suit and tie, gripping the edge of a long mahogany table as lawmakers grilled me. Cameras flashed. The entire country watched as I said, "They used HOA fines as a cover for psychological warfare. They terrorized ordinary Americans in their own homes. I'm here because I believe we're better than that." One congresswoman leaned forward, eyes fierce. "Mr. Callahan, why didn't you just give up and comply?" I stared at her. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent." When the hearing ended, people in the gallery stood and clapped. A woman slipped me a note. "Thank you for fighting for all of us." But when I got home, the real work remained. David and I sat on the porch, listening to crickets singing under the stars. "You think we'll ever go back to normal?" he asked quietly. I stared out at the dark fields. "I hope not." He blinked. "Why not?" "Because normal is what let them hide," I said. "We need a new normal. One where people ask questions. One where nobody's afraid to stand up." David reached over and took my hand. "Then that's what we'll build." We sat there in silence, breathing in the cool night air. A breeze rustled through the lavender by the fence. It smelled like freedom. A month later, the DOJ released findings that Circle 1 had violated dozens of federal laws. Indictments rolled out for half a dozen contractors, federal employees, and private security operators. Karen pled guilty to conspiracy and fraud. She's facing 25 years. Jake disappeared again. Part of me wanted to hunt him down and ask why. Part of me knew the answer wouldn't matter. One crisp autumn morning, Kyle rode up to my gate on his motorcycle. He handed me a small wooden plaque. "This neighborhood belongs to its people." I nailed it to my fence. Not because it meant we were safe forever, but because it meant we were ready if the bastards ever came back. A few weeks later, a news crew returned for an interview. The reporter asked me, "Do you think this could happen again?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes," I said. "It can. But this time, we'll be ready." Because that's what freedom costs. Vigilance. And I was willing to pay it. Winter crept over Simmons Valley like a blanket of silver frost. In the mornings, I'd step outside and see my breath hanging in the air, fog rolling low over the fields. The lavender I'd planted had gone dormant, stems gray and brittle under a crust of ice. But the neighborhood was more alive than it had been in years. We held community meetings twice a month now. No secret votes. No hidden committees. Neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder on metal folding chairs in the community hall, steam rising from coffee cups as people hashed out real concerns. Road repairs, holiday decorations, who volunteered to fix the playground swings. The first few meetings were rough. People shouted, argued, accused each other of being Karen's spies. Trust doesn't come back overnight. But by January, something shifted. A woman named Sherry stood up one evening and cleared her throat. "I used to be afraid to even wave at my neighbors," she said. "I thought I'd get a violation for putting the wrong flowers in my garden. But I want to say, I'm done hiding." The room erupted in applause. Kyle stood up and announced he was organizing a neighborhood barbecue. No hidden cameras. No fake fines. Just ribs and beer. The place burst into laughter. That same week, I got a call from a lawyer with the Department of Justice. "Mr. Callahan, we're pursuing restitution for everyone defrauded by Circle 1. We'd like you to testify during sentencing." I flew to the federal courthouse in D.C. It was bitterly cold, wind scouring the streets between towering gray buildings. Inside the courtroom, I took the stand and faced Karen Whitaker across the room. She sat in her orange jumpsuit, hair pulled back, jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles twitch in her neck. The prosecutor asked me to explain what Karen had done. I spoke for 40 minutes. I described the letters, the fines, the surveillance, the threats. I described how my neighbors had been terrified in their own homes, how veterans like me were labeled threats for simply living in peace. I saw Karen flinch when I talked about Mrs. Vaughn crying behind her curtains. When I finished, the judge leaned forward and said, "Mr. Callahan, is there anything else you wish to say to this court?" I looked straight at Karen. "Yeah," I said. "I've fought enemies overseas. But the worst enemies are the ones who pretend to be your neighbors while stealing your freedom. You didn't just try to steal our money. You tried to steal our courage. You failed." A hush fell over the courtroom. Karen didn't look at me again. The judge sentenced her to 25 years without possibility of parole. As I left the stand, An elderly man in the gallery stood up and started clapping. Within seconds, the whole courtroom was on its feet. I stepped into the corridor, feeling 20 years lighter. Outside, reporters swarmed me. Chief Callahan, how do you feel about the sentence? I paused, choosing my words carefully. I feel like justice showed up late. But it showed up. That night, back home, neighbors gathered around my fire pit. The flames crackled high, sparks drifting into the starry dark. Kyle raised his beer. To the man who taught us how to fight back. I shook my head. We all fought back. Together. Mrs. Vaughn stood beside me, wrapped in a thick quilt. I used to be afraid to even come outside, she said. But I'm not afraid anymore. Her voice cracked. Because of you. David slipped an arm around my waist. You changed this place, Callahan. I stared into the fire, feeling the heat against my face. No. We changed it. And we're gonna keep it that way. Weeks passed. Snow blanketed Simmons Valley. Kids slid down the slopes behind the church, shrieking with laughter. One morning, I found a letter slipped under my door. No threats this time. Just a note from Mrs. Henderson, written in careful cursive. Dear Mr. Callahan, thank you for giving me my home back. I can look out my window without fear again. God bless you. I folded the letter and put it in the same box where I'd kept all the evidence against Karen, because reminders of why we fight matter as much as reminders of how. National news didn't let go of the story. Senators debated new laws about HOAs and privacy rights. Talk shows argued over whether Circle One was just bad actors or a symptom of deeper corruption. One night, I was invited onto a national news program via satellite link. The host asked, Chief Callahan, do you think this could happen anywhere else? I didn't hesitate. It already has. This wasn't about one town. It's about power. The only thing stopping people like Karen is neighbors, who refuse to stay silent. The host leaned closer. Do you think America has forgotten how to fight back? I smiled. No. We just needed reminding. By spring, federal investigators were auditing other suspicious HOAs. I heard from homeowners in California, Georgia, Texas, Ohio, all places where Circle One had left fingerprints. One woman in Arizona called me in tears. They said they'd take my house if I didn't change my shutters. I can't afford lawyers. I connected her with pro bono help, and that's how my days went. Emails, calls, advising strangers how to fight invisible bullies. But life went on. David and I planted new lavender where the old had withered. Neighbors stopped by with seedlings for my garden. A man I barely knew dropped off a basket of fresh eggs and said, We're keeping watch, Chief. One warm evening, Kyle rolled up on his bike. Gonna run for mayor? He teased. I laughed. I'd rather eat sand. He smirked. Still, you're the reason this place is ours again. I thought about that as I stood in the yard later, looking at the mountains glowing pink in the sunset. I thought about how close we'd come to losing everything. Not to bombs. Not to soldiers, but to paperwork. To lies typed neatly in letters. To fear. And I realized that's how freedom dies. Not with tanks in the streets, but with a neighbor knocking on your door holding a clipboard. But only if you let it. I turned and saw David watching me from the porch, his smile tired but soft. Come inside, he called. You've been fighting the world long enough for today. I nodded. Just one more minute. Because I wanted to remember this moment, the lavender, the distant sound of kids laughing, the knowledge that we'd survived, and the certainty that if the shadows came creeping back, we'd fight them off again, not because we loved war, but because we loved home, and home is worth every battle. Spring turned the hills around Simmons Valley emerald and gold. The ice melted from the creeks. Songbirds came back to the trees. The air smelled clean, like new beginnings, but I didn't let my guard down. Neither did the neighborhood. One afternoon, we gathered at the community center to vote on new bylaws. Real ones this time. Simple rules about noise, trash pickup, and shared spaces. No hidden fines, no secret cameras. Kyle stood up at the meeting. I propose we put in writing that no one in this neighborhood will ever again have the power to run secret operations, find people without cause, or threaten families. Everyone clapped. We passed the motion unanimously. Later, as people milled around drinking coffee, Mrs. Vaughn came over to me. You know what the best part is? She said. People talk to each other again. We're not hiding behind fences anymore. I nodded. That's how we stay safe. Together. But the shadows still lurk beyond our valley. The DOJ kept sending me updates. New investigations were popping up like weeds. Other communities discovering fake fines, mysterious liens, sudden appearances of compliance officers. In Ohio, a woman called me in the middle of the night. Mr. Callahan, they told me my front porch color violates HOA standards. I don't even have an HOA. I stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours. By dawn, she decided to call her local news station. I'm tired of being scared, she said. I want to fight back. That was becoming a familiar chorus. People were waking up. The federal hearings dragged on into the summer. I got called back to testify again. This time, they wanted specifics about policy. About how to prevent programs, like Circle One, from hiding in plain sight. I stood in front of the microphone under glaring lights and said, The government needs oversight. No private group should ever have police powers. And no American should live in fear because someone decides they're inconvenient. Lawmakers nodded. Cameras flashed, but I could tell some of them still didn't get it. After the hearing, a young aide stopped me in the hallway. Mr. Callahan, why didn't you just pay the fines and stay quiet? I stared at him. Because the moment you pay, they own you. He opened his mouth to say something else, but couldn't seem to find the words. I left him standing there under the marble columns, looking small against the vastness of the Capitol. Back home, I kept working with journalists. Podcasts invited me to tell the story. Radio shows. Community organizations. People wanted to know how to spot the signs. How to push back. How to protect their neighbors. I told them the same thing every time. It starts small. A letter. A rule. A threat. Don't ignore it. Shine light on it. Talk to your neighbors. Because they can't control you if you're united. By August, new federal legislation passed. It forced all HOA-type organizations to publicly register their officers, financial statements, and legal authority. It set criminal penalties for impersonating government officials or filing fake liens. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. When the bill passed, I got a call from the congresswoman who championed it. "This wouldn't have happened without you, Mr. Callahan." I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "It happened because Americans finally got mad enough to stand up." She laughed. "Sometimes that's what it takes." Meanwhile, Simmons Valley kept healing. One evening in September, we held a block party under strings of lanterns. Neighbors brought pies and grilled ribs. Kids raced around waving glow sticks. Someone hooked up a speaker and played country music so loud you could hear it echoing off the hills. Mrs. Perkins, who'd moved away, came back for the party. She hugged me so hard my ribs cracked. "I couldn't stay away," she said. "This place is home." David and I stood together under the lanterns, holding paper plates piled with food. He leaned over. "You think they'll ever try this again?" I sipped my sweet tea. "Of course they will. Somewhere. Maybe even here." He frowned. "Then how do we stop it?" I thought about that for a long time. Finally I said, "By never forgetting what it looked like. By noticing the signs. By refusing to stay silent." He smiled. "That sounds exhausting." I grinned back. "Freedom usually is." As the night wound down, the neighbors gathered around a bonfire. Someone passed around marshmallows on sticks. Kyle pulled out his guitar and played a rough version of "This Land Is Your Land." People sang along, voices rising into the warm night air. I sat there listening, feeling the music vibrate in my chest, thinking how strange life is. A year ago, I'd been living in silence, certain I'd left battles behind. Now I knew better. Battles aren't always fought with guns and bombs. Sometimes they come on letterhead, in whispered threats, behind smiles, and sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stand up and say, "No." Around midnight, as the fire burned low, Mrs. Vaughn tapped me on the shoulder. "Mr. Callahan," she said softly, "I want to thank you again for giving us back our courage." I looked around the circle of faces glowing in the firelight. People who'd once been strangers, now bound together by something stronger than fear. "It wasn't just me," I told her. "It was all of us." She smiled. "Still, it had to start somewhere." When I finally went home at night, I stood for a while in the yard, breathing in the scent of lavender on the cool breeze. The stars glittered overhead, endless and bright, and I made myself a promise. If they ever came for us again, if another Karen or Circle One rose up, I wouldn't wait in silence. I'd fight. Because home isn't just land or a house. It's the place where you decide who you are. And I decided I'd never be the man who stayed quiet, not ever again.